The morning of August 17, 1943, was quiet at the Rintenheath railway platform in East Prussia. The air carried the faint chill of early summer, mingled with the scent of coal smoke from distant trains. At 10:15 a.m., General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's ace and fighter commander, stood rigid, watching the arrival of a luxury train destined for Berlin. On it boarded Reichsmarshall Hermann Göring, the man whose orders dictated the fate of Germany's air forces. The two had just concluded a tense conference on fighter operations, but Galland's mind was elsewhere. Reports had reached him overnight, reports that could not be ignored. American fighters had been spotted deep inside German airspace, far beyond the range anyone in the Reich believed possible. Earlier that day, Luftwaffe squadrons had intercepted a massive American bomber raid over Regensburg and Schweinfurt, following the predictable pattern they had trained to expect. German fighters waited near the border, ready to engage bombers once their escorts, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, turned back due to limited fuel. The bombers continued into Germany, now largely unprotected, and the Luftwaffe attacked. But this day the pattern shattered. New American fighters appeared, not Thunderbolts, but Lockheed P-38 Lightnings. Equipped with external drop tanks, they could extend their range far beyond what the Luftwaffe had ever encountered. Squadron reports flooded in, engagements occurring over 150 miles inside Germany, at Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and targets thought unreachable. These were fully operational fighters, not damaged planes gliding from France or Belgium. Galland's mission was clear. He had to deliver this intelligence before Göring's train departed. The Reichsmarshal, however, had a mind locked in denial. Galland approached, papers clutched tightly, the weight of impending catastrophe heavy on his shoulders. He explained the reports, described the extended-range drop tanks, outlined the unprecedented threat. Göring's reaction was swift and decisive, but wrong. His face reddened, voice rising with disbelief. "Impossible," he barked. "No American fighters have penetrated this far. These reports are false. Damaged aircraft drifting east, nothing more." Galland countered patiently, pointing out multiple reports from different squadrons, all confirming the same encounters. He described the tactical consequences. The Luftwaffe could no longer wait for escort fighters to turn back. Their old doctrine was obsolete. But Göring cut him off, issuing a direct order. The threat did not exist. The Reichsmarshal would not allow intelligence to contradict his assumptions. Galland's reply was simple, almost ironic, yet tinged with despair. "Orders are orders, sir." The train began to move, the clatter of wheels on rails echoing his foreboding realization. The Luftwaffe had just lost its chance to prepare for a threat that would devastate its fighter force. By the end of that same day, losses confirmed Galland's worst fears. During the Regensburg-Schweinfurt raids, German fighters fell 25 to 27 strong, destroyed by exactly the long-range P-38s Göring insisted were impossible. Galland's warning had been ignored, and the Luftwaffe paid the price immediately. The old tactic, waiting for American escorts to turn back, was now a death sentence. 3 weeks later, September 6, 1943, Stuttgart became the next proving ground. Major Egon Mayer, one of Germany's most skilled bomber-destroyers with 57 confirmed kills, led his squadron against a formation of B-17s. His plan, a head-on attack that minimized exposure to defensive fire. Initial strikes were promising, hits on multiple bombers, but then P-38 escorts appeared, diving from altitude. Mayer's formation scattered. 3 fighters were shot down instantly, 2 pilots captured, and Mayer himself narrowly escaped. No bombers were destroyed in this engagement. The mission was a stark illustration. American fighters could now escort bombers deep into Germany, negating every assumption the Luftwaffe had operated under. By October 1943, the pattern of destruction was undeniable. American bombers penetrated German airspace with fighter escorts, striking targets previously considered safe. The Luftwaffe continued to rely on outdated tactics, sending pilots to their deaths under the assumption that escorts could not reach central Germany. On October 14, 1943, the infamous Black Thursday raid on Schweinfurt saw 60 American bombers lost, but German losses were nearly equal: 38 fighters and 42 pilots. The once favorable exchange rate, 3 or 4 bombers destroyed for each fighter lost, had collapsed. Germany's air superiority was slipping through their fingers. Among the casualties were elite aces. Headman Wilhelm Leh, 23 years old, with 131 kills, died near the Netherlands. Experienced pilots, leaders capable of shaping the next generation, were being destroyed. Galland recognized the implications immediately. The Luftwaffe could no longer replace its most valuable asset, experienced pilots, fast enough to sustain operations. He compiled reports detailing losses from June through October 1943. June, 87 fighters lost. July, 106. August, 174. September, 193. October, 224. The trend was unmistakable. Losses were accelerating, and the proportion of seasoned pilots was shrinking. In June, 60% of fighter pilots had more than 6 months of combat experience. By October, only 40% did. Without immediate intervention, Galland warned, the fighter force would collapse within 6 months, exceeding the training system's capacity to replace casualties. Galland sent his reports to Göring, the Air Ministry, and anyone who would listen. The response was silence. Göring refused to acknowledge the crisis. Directives were issued to boost morale and push for more aggressive tactics, but no one addressed the core problem. The Luftwaffe was outnumbered, outproduced, and outmatched by superior Allied fighters with extended range. The failure of leadership was becoming painfully clear. Galland's intelligence had been accurate. His recommendations, accelerated training, increased fighter production, and urgent deployment of the jet-powered Me-262, were ignored. American bomber formations would continue to penetrate German airspace with near impunity. The cost would be measured in the lives of Germany's best pilots. By the close of 1943, the Luftwaffe's situation was grim. American P-51 Mustangs, soon to arrive, would exacerbate the problem further, combining range, speed, and maneuverability unlike any fighter Germany had faced. Galland had foreseen it. His warnings, if heeded, might have bought months of time, saved hundreds of pilots, and altered tactical decisions. Instead, the Luftwaffe marched toward inevitable attrition under the shadow of denial. The morning train at Rinton Heath had long disappeared from view, but Galland's sense of foreboding did not fade. That single moment, August 17, 1943, marked the point where leadership choices would cost Germany its air supremacy, and the cost would be catastrophic. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe's precarious position was worsening. The initial shock of long-range P-38 raids had not yet fully sunk in, but the patterns were undeniable. American forces were adapting rapidly. Intelligence reports confirmed that the USAF was experimenting with even longer-range escorts. The North American P-51 Mustang, a fighter with unmatched speed, maneuverability, and endurance. Once deployed over Germany, these aircraft would render traditional Luftwaffe interception strategies obsolete. Galland, now more desperate than ever, held emergency meetings with his fighter group commanders at various airfields across East and Central Germany. He outlined the evolving threat, emphasizing the unprecedented challenge of escort fighters accompanying bombers to industrial targets deep within the Reich. He pushed the idea that only technological innovation and tactical flexibility could prevent disaster. His suggestions included accelerating the production of jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262, developing specialized high-altitude interceptors, and retraining pilots for hit-and-run tactics. Yet at every turn, Galland's proposals were thwarted by bureaucratic inertia and Göring's denial. The Reichsmarshall refused to prioritize the jets, insisting that the Luftwaffe's current fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, were sufficient. Reports of mounting losses were dismissed as exaggerations or isolated incidents. Galland's frustration grew. He had witnessed firsthand the capability and efficiency of American long-range fighters, and he knew delay would cost the Luftwaffe dearly. On October 14, 1943, the Luftwaffe faced a defining moment: the Second Schweinfurt raid. Hundreds of American B-17s aimed for the heart of German ball-bearing production. Fighter controllers scrambled hundreds of Luftwaffe planes to intercept. Galland watched the unfolding chaos from the operations room at Lechfeld, calculating losses as reports arrived. The numbers were staggering. German fighters destroyed some bombers, approximately 36, but the Luftwaffe lost 38 fighters and 42 pilots, many of them seasoned aces. Among them was Major Egon Mayer, whose innovative tactics against bomber formations had earned him distinction. He was killed during a head-on attack on a B-17 formation protected by P-38 escorts. Experienced pilots, critical for training replacements and leading missions, were being wiped out faster than the Luftwaffe could replace them. The aftermath left Galland shaken. He wrote a detailed memo titled Immediate Risks to Luftwaffe Operational Capacity, presenting statistical evidence of pilot attrition, aircraft losses, and the unsustainability of current tactics. His memo stressed that without urgent changes in production priorities and deployment strategies, Germany would lose air superiority over its own territory within months. Meanwhile, American technological developments continued to outpace the Luftwaffe. Reports from reconnaissance planes indicated that the P-51 Mustang was entering active service with fighter groups based in England. These fighters could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and return without refueling, an unprecedented strategic shift. Galland immediately warned that Luftwaffe pilots, operating under outdated doctrine, would be exposed to devastating losses once the P-51s were fully deployed. The months of October and November 1943 confirmed his fears. Interceptions of American bombers were met with increasingly sophisticated and coordinated escort tactics. Luftwaffe fighters, often outnumbered and outpaced, struggled to engage effectively. The losses were compounded by mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and inexperienced replacements being sent into combat prematurely. Galland observed one particularly harrowing mission in late November. A squadron of Bf-109s, led by a young but capable Oberleutnant, was tasked with intercepting a formation of American B-17s near Dresden. Initially, the fighters engaged successfully, taking down 2 bombers. But then P-51s arrived from the north, cutting off escape routes. In under 10 minutes, the Luftwaffe unit had lost 4 of its 6 aircraft, including the squadron leader. The remaining pilots barely returned to base. Galland noted in his log, "Losses continue at unsustainable rates. The enemy adapts faster than we respond. We are facing a crisis." Despite mounting evidence, Göring remained unconvinced. At meetings of the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, OKL, he emphasized morale, claiming that the Luftwaffe still maintained air superiority over most occupied territories. Galland, however, understood the reality. The Luftwaffe's losses were not isolated, they were systemic. Experienced pilots were dying, replacement training lagged behind, and production of advanced aircraft like the Me-262 was delayed by interference from bureaucracy and Hitler's insistence on using the jet as a bomber. In response, Galland adopted a dual strategy. He intensified training programs for young pilots, emphasizing combat survival and evasive maneuvers, and he pushed for tactical innovations, including rotational deployments to prevent entire squadrons from being destroyed in single engagements. Yet these measures were insufficient against the sheer number of American bombers and their long-range escorts. By December 1943, the scale of destruction was undeniable. In a single raid over Hamburg, Luftwaffe fighters intercepted 150 bombers. Losses: 44 fighters, 50 pilots, including several aces. Damage to German infrastructure was severe, with key factories suffering repeated strikes despite the Luftwaffe's attempts at defense. Galland compiled another urgent report, emphasizing that if the Luftwaffe could not adapt quickly, the bomber offensive would cripple Germany's war production by mid-1944. Meanwhile, in private, Galland expressed growing frustration. He confided to close aides, "We fight bravely, but we are dying for an impossible cause. Our leadership refuses to see what is happening. Each raid costs us more than we can afford, and soon there will be no one left to fly." His words foreshadowed the coming months, in which the Luftwaffe would face attrition beyond recovery. Despite these grim circumstances, Galland remained committed to defending the Reich. He studied American tactics meticulously, seeking weaknesses in bomber formations and escort coordination. He implemented head-on attack strategies, high-speed diving interceptions, and synchronized group maneuvers, aiming to minimize losses while maximizing damage to enemy bombers. Some successes occurred, but they were increasingly fleeting and costly. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang marked a turning point. For the first time, American escorts could protect bombers all the way to Berlin and back, changing the strategic balance. The Luftwaffe, already weakened by earlier losses, was unable to respond effectively. Galland's warnings, delivered with urgency months before, had gone unheeded. By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe faced an inescapable truth. The era of uncontested fighter superiority was over. The Reichsmarschall's denial had come at a high price, and Galland could only watch as Germany's air defense capabilities eroded with every raid. Part 2 Summary. The P-51 Mustang enters service, extending American fighter escort capabilities. Luftwaffe losses accelerate in late 1943, particularly experienced aces. Galland pushes for tactical innovations and jet production, but Göring refuses. Systemic attrition begins to threaten Germany's air defense and industrial protection. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's situation had deteriorated further. The relentless American bombing campaign, now fully escorted by P-51 Mustangs, had forced the Luftwaffe into a defensive posture over its own homeland. Galland, still at the forefront of fighter command, had grown increasingly concerned about the unsustainable rate of pilot and aircraft losses. Every engagement revealed the widening gap between technology and tactics on one side, and bureaucratic inaction and outdated doctrine on the other. The winter months of 1943 to 1944 had been particularly brutal. The Luftwaffe struggled to maintain operational readiness as fuel shortages, mechanical attrition, and weather-related grounding compounded the losses inflicted by American bombers. Pilots returning from missions reported exhaustion, frostbite, and diminishing morale. Galland, observing firsthand the stress and fatigue among his units, recognized that the Luftwaffe's human factor was as critical as its machines. In January 1944, intelligence confirmed that the Allies were planning a massive strategic bombing campaign targeting Germany's industrial heart. Factories producing ball bearings, aircraft engines, and synthetic fuel were prioritized, along with transportation hubs essential for mobilization. Galland understood that the Luftwaffe's remaining fighter strength would be tested to its limits. He advocated for rotational rest for elite units, concentrated training for inexperienced pilots, and selective engagement strategies to preserve aces for decisive confrontations rather than attritional skirmishes. However, his warnings continued to clash with Göring's optimism and Hitler's strategic impatience. The Reichsmarschall, confident in the Luftwaffe's superiority, insisted on massed interceptions regardless of the risks. This approach proved catastrophic during Operation Argument, the massive February raid on Berlin. Over 800 American bombers penetrated German airspace, protected by hundreds of P-51 and P-38 escorts. Galland's fighters were quickly overwhelmed. Reports documented staggering losses. Over 60 aircraft destroyed and 55 pilots killed, including veteran squadron leaders. American bombers, despite heavy flak, inflicted severe damage to industrial targets, and Luftwaffe resistance was insufficient to prevent widespread destruction. Galland noted bitterly in his operational log, "We are throwing men into a furnace without adequate protection. Our doctrine is obsolete. Our leadership remains blind." Amid these disasters, Galland pushed for technological adaptation. He emphasized accelerated deployment of the Me-262 jet fighter, now ready in prototype form, and advocated the development of rocket-assisted interceptors capable of climbing rapidly to bomber altitude. Hitler, however, insisted on using the Me-262 as a bomber rather than as a pure interceptor, a decision that frustrated Galland and his technical advisors. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy had shifted to fragmented, hit-and-run tactics, with small groups attempting high-speed dives on bomber formations. While some aces achieved remarkable successes, the tactics could not compensate for overwhelming numbers and superior Allied technology. Attrition remained relentless, and experienced pilots, critical for training the next generation, were increasingly rare. Galland also observed a shift in the nature of air combat. Engagements with the P-51 were unlike anything the Luftwaffe had previously faced. The Mustang's long-range capability, superior maneuverability at high altitudes, and coordinated formation flying made traditional head-on attacks and formation-based interceptions nearly suicidal. Pilots reported that even brief encounters with escort fighters often resulted in irrecoverable losses. Galland recognized that tactical innovation alone could not fully counter technological disparities. The Luftwaffe required strategic reinvention. The Allied bomber offensive intensified further in April and May 1944, coinciding with preparations for Operation Overlord, the upcoming Allied invasion of Normandy. German industry, already weakened by previous raids, was now at critical risk, with transportation networks, oil refineries, and aircraft production plants suffering repeated attacks. Galland's reports to the High Command emphasized the strategic vulnerability of the Reich and the urgent need to prioritize defense of key industrial zones, rather than dispersing fighter units across numerous minor targets. Galland personally oversaw several missions during this period. One particularly notable engagement occurred in mid-April, when a formation of Me-109s, despite being outnumbered 3-1, intercepted a group of 200 American bombers near Leipzig. Galland led the squadron in a coordinated head-on attack, managing to down several bombers, but the cost was severe. Nearly half of his unit was lost. Survivors reported the mission as both heroic and tragic, demonstrating the skill and courage of German pilots, but also highlighting the unsustainable nature of these engagements. As casualties mounted, Galland became increasingly critical of Reich leadership. He documented a series of memos titled Urgent Recommendations for Fighter Command Reform, detailing 3 core priorities: immediate conversion of the Me-262 to interceptor roles, halting its use as a bomber; concentration of elite fighter units near high-value industrial zones and transportation hubs; enhanced pilot training and rotation programs to prevent total burnout of experienced personnel. Despite the clarity and urgency of these proposals, resistance remained. Bureaucratic inertia, combined with Hitler's insistence on unrealistic offensive use of jet aircraft, prevented meaningful change. Galland's frustration grew, but he continued to advocate tirelessly for operational reform, often clashing with subordinates who had accepted the increasingly hopeless strategic situation. By June 1944, just before the D-Day invasion, the Luftwaffe faced catastrophic losses and near exhaustion of resources. Allied bombers had effectively neutralized German industrial production, and fighter units were unable to mount sustained defense. Galland's warnings, now documented in exhaustive reports and logs, painted a stark picture. The Luftwaffe was no longer capable of contesting Allied air superiority over Germany, and further delays in strategic adaptation would result in irreversible consequences. Despite these setbacks, Galland remained a symbol of resilience and leadership. He continued to push for innovation, personally overseeing missions, refining tactics, and attempting to preserve the remaining fighter elite. His diaries from this period reveal a man torn between loyalty to his pilots, frustration with leadership, and the grim reality of the Reich's collapsing air defenses. As Part 3 closes, the Luftwaffe stands at a crossroads. Technological potential exists in the form of jets and advanced interceptors, but bureaucratic mismanagement, Hitler's interference, and relentless Allied pressure threatened to render these innovations too little, too late. Galland's foresight and tactical brilliance remain one of the few bright spots in a system rapidly unraveling under external and internal pressures. Part 3 Summary. Allied bombing campaigns escalate. P-51 Mustangs dominate high-altitude engagements. Luftwaffe suffers catastrophic losses in pilots and aircraft, including veteran aces. Galland advocates for Me-262 jets as interceptors, better pilot rotation, and tactical reform. By early June 1944, the situation for the Luftwaffe had reached a critical stage. Allied intelligence and reconnaissance had confirmed the imminent launch of Operation Overlord, the massive invasion of Normandy. Galland, aware of the Luftwaffe's depleted strength and the superior numbers of Allied aircraft, understood that the coming weeks would test every ounce of skill, strategy, and courage in German air forces. The Luftwaffe had fewer than 1,000 operational fighters available in Western Europe, and many of these were piloted by inexperienced recruits hastily promoted after the losses of 1943 and early 1944. Galland personally oversaw the deployment of elite Jägerschwader units, concentrating them near coastal sectors where the Allies were most likely to land. Despite his meticulous planning, the sheer scale of the invasion fleet and air cover made effective defense almost impossible. On June 6, 1944, the Allies commenced the Normandy landings. Thousands of transport ships, landing craft, and warships crossed the English Channel under the protection of over 13,000 Allied aircraft, including bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes. Galland's fighters, numbering only a fraction of this, were scrambled immediately. They faced the daunting task of intercepting heavily escorted bomber formations and attacking the landing forces while avoiding destruction. The Luftwaffe's first sorties were disastrous. American and British fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires, dominated the skies, outmaneuvering German aircraft and inflicting heavy losses. Galland personally led several missions, demonstrating extraordinary courage, but even he could not overcome the overwhelming numbers. Reports from this day indicate dozens of fighters shot down within minutes of takeoff, with many more pilots killed or captured. Galland's strategy focused on rapid hit-and-run attacks, diving from high altitude to strike bombers or landing craft before quickly retreating. While these tactics occasionally disrupted Allied formations, the losses were unsustainable. Experienced pilots were killed, and replacements often lacked the training necessary to survive combat against superior aircraft and veteran Allied airmen. In the days following D-Day, the Luftwaffe attempted to regain some control over the skies of Normandy, but each engagement highlighted the inevitable decline of German air power. Allied air superiority allowed them to supply troops, conduct reconnaissance, and provide close air support without significant interference. Galland repeatedly stressed in his reports that without immediate reinforcements and a strategic shift, the Luftwaffe could no longer influence the outcome of the land campaign. By late June 1944, Galland also had to contend with the introduction of the Me-262 jet fighter into combat, though in limited numbers. While these jets offered superior speed and firepower, logistical issues and Hitler's insistence on their use as bombers hindered their effectiveness. Galland's pilots achieved several remarkable kills, downing heavy bombers with precision strikes, but the numbers were too small to change the strategic situation. The jets were also vulnerable during takeoff and landing, and Allied fighters quickly adapted to intercept them. Galland's personal frustration grew. He witnessed brave pilots sacrificed in missions dictated by unrealistic strategic expectations, and he understood that the Luftwaffe's survival depended on preserving its remaining core of experienced pilots rather than risking them in futile mass engagements. In internal communications, he wrote, "We are at the end of our rope. Each mission drains the few warriors left, while our leaders cling to illusions of control." During July 1944, the Luftwaffe attempted several concentrated attacks on Allied beachheads and supply lines. These missions, though tactically well executed, achieved only temporary disruptions. Allied forces adapted quickly, leveraging airborne radar, fighter cover, and naval artillery to neutralize Luftwaffe strikes. Galland, despite his strategic insights, faced constant interference from political commanders who refused to acknowledge the hopelessness of attritional strategies. Compounding these difficulties, Galland had to manage internal dissent and morale issues. Pilots, aware of the high casualty rates and the futility of many missions, grew demoralized. Galland's leadership was crucial. He often flew alongside his men, shared in their risks, and worked tirelessly to maintain cohesion and purpose. He emphasized that skill, discipline, and calculated risk-taking could still produce tactical victories, even if the broader strategic situation was dire. By August 1944, following the breakout from Normandy and the rapid Allied advance across France, the Luftwaffe faced complete operational exhaustion in Western Europe. Galland's reports documented severe pilot shortages, inadequate aircraft availability, and critical fuel deficits. He also noted the collapse of Germany's ability to defend vital transportation corridors and industrial centers, warning that further delays in strategic adaptation could accelerate the Reich's downfall. Despite these challenges, Galland continued to innovate tactically. He oversaw mixed unit operations, combining Me-109s, FW-190s, and the limited Me-262 jets in coordinated strikes. He experimented with low-altitude interception techniques, night fighter deployments, and rapid redeployment of squadrons, all aimed at maximizing impact while minimizing losses. While these methods occasionally achieved impressive results, such as downing dozens of Allied bombers in isolated engagements, they could not reverse the overarching trend of Allied air dominance. By the end of August 1944, the Luftwaffe's once feared fighter command had been reduced to a shadow of its former self in the West. Experienced pilots were nearly gone, replacement training programs could not keep pace, and fuel and maintenance shortages further crippled operational readiness. Galland, reflecting on these months, wrote in his diary, "We have fought with valor, skill, and ingenuity, yet the enemy's numbers and resources leave us little hope. Only leadership and vision might have turned the tide, but these were denied to us." Part 4 Summary. D-Day and the Normandy invasion marked the Luftwaffe's desperate defensive struggle. Outnumbered and outmatched, German fighters suffer catastrophic losses. Galland attempts tactical innovation, including use of Me-262 jets and mixed unit strikes. Attrition and resource shortages make effective resistance increasingly impossible. Despite bravery and skill, the Luftwaffe can no longer contest Allied air superiority. By September 1944, the Luftwaffe was in systemic collapse. The Western Front was overrun with Allied forces advancing at unprecedented speed after the success of Operation Overlord. The once feared German air arm, now depleted in both pilots and aircraft, faced an enemy whose air superiority was absolute. Galland, though still determined and resilient, had to confront a grim reality. The Luftwaffe could no longer influence the outcome of the war. Galland's priorities shifted from offensive operations to the preservation of remaining fighter units. He recognized that each engagement risked annihilating trained pilots whose experience could never be replaced. Commanders above him, however, continued to issue impossible demands, insisting on attacks against heavily defended targets, even when the Luftwaffe could not hope to succeed. Galland often ignored orders he deemed suicidal, focusing instead on tactical withdrawal, regrouping, and defensive operations. Fuel shortages were now critical. With Allied forces controlling much of Western Europe, the Luftwaffe's supply lines were fragmented. Many aircraft were grounded, not by enemy action but by the lack of gasoline. Galland personally lobbied the Reich Air Ministry to prioritize fighter fuel over other uses, arguing that without fuel, the Luftwaffe's elite units would be entirely wasted. He emphasized that air defense of German cities and infrastructure was now the primary mission, rather than futile attempts to strike Allied forces advancing into France and Belgium. In October 1944, the Luftwaffe faced another severe blow. The Allied bombing campaign intensified over German industrial centers. Cities such as Düsseldorf, Cologne, and Frankfurt suffered relentless air raids. Galland's fighters attempted to intercept the bombers, often achieving tactical successes, downing dozens of bombers in single engagements. Yet these victories were Pyrrhic. For every bomber destroyed, the Luftwaffe lost multiple experienced pilots and aircraft it could not replace. The introduction of the Me-262 jet fighter finally reached operational numbers, but with limited impact. Hitler's insistence on using them as jet bombers, rather than pure interceptors, delayed their effective deployment. Galland protested vigorously, understanding that the jet's speed and firepower could dominate Allied bombers if employed correctly. He lobbied for fighter-only jet wings, but bureaucracy and political interference hindered implementation. Despite this, small jet units achieved remarkable tactical victories, striking fear into Allied bomber crews, but they could not change the strategic imbalance. By November 1944, the situation had deteriorated further. The Luftwaffe's numbers were critically low, morale was fragile, and experienced pilots were exhausted. Galland's diaries from this period reflect his internal struggle, balancing duty to his country with the responsibility for the lives of young men under his command. He often wrote, "I am responsible for the survival of men whose training took years, yet I am commanded to waste them in hopeless attacks. Obedience is required, but conscience protests." Galland also faced the Eastern Front crisis. The Red Army's rapid advance into Poland and East Prussia demanded fighter coverage, but Western Front priorities left the eastern sectors underdefended. Galland attempted to redeploy units strategically, but logistical challenges and fuel scarcity made it nearly impossible. His reports highlighted that without sufficient fuel and aircraft, defense in any theater was inadequate, a stark warning that went largely unheeded by higher command. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe had become a shadow force. Its elite units were fragmented, with squadrons operating independently, often with only a handful of aircraft. The Battle of the Bulge saw desperate attempts to support German ground forces, but Allied air dominance prevented meaningful intervention. Galland's few remaining experienced pilots flew daring sorties, sometimes engaging Allied formations at severe numerical disadvantage. But each success was temporary and came at a high cost. Galland himself was no longer just a commander, but a symbol of resistance and professionalism. Pilots revered him for leading by example, often flying missions alongside them in the face of almost certain death. Yet he remained painfully aware that these efforts could not alter Germany's strategic fate. His final months in command were spent prioritizing the survival of trained personnel, maintaining morale, and executing defensive missions that could provide any tactical advantage. As 1945 dawned, Germany was on the brink of defeat. Allied forces were closing in from the west. The Red Army was entering Berlin's vicinity from the east, and the Luftwaffe's remnants were scattered, disorganized, and almost powerless. Galland oversaw the last organized fighter operations, focusing on defending the Reich's skies and providing reconnaissance where possible. Even in these desperate circumstances, he continued to insist on disciplined, strategic action, never succumbing to panic or despair. On May 8, 1945, with Germany's surrender, Galland's command effectively ended. The Luftwaffe had been decimated by years of attrition, overwhelming Allied numbers, and strategic mismanagement. Yet Galland's leadership preserved a core of trained pilots who survived the war. In his memoirs, he later reflected on the heroism, sacrifice, and skill of the Luftwaffe's men, lamenting the lost opportunities caused by political interference and strategic short-sightedness. He wrote, "We fought with skill and valor, but we were constrained by decisions beyond our control. Our pilots died not for victory, but for orders that could not be fulfilled. Yet their courage remains." Galland's legacy is complex. A brilliant tactician and leader, admired by his men, yet powerless to save the Luftwaffe from the strategic realities of total war. His final months illustrate the limits of individual leadership in the face of overwhelming forces, and the importance of preserving professional expertise even when the outcome seems inevitable. Despite the collapse, Galland's influence on fighter tactics, jet aircraft deployment, and leadership principles continued to be studied by future generations of airmen. Part 5 Summary. Luftwaffe faces systemic collapse by late 1944 and early 1945. Galland focuses on preservation of pilots, tactical defense, and effective jet deployment. Fuel shortages, political interference, and Allied air dominance cripple operations. Galland personally leads missions, maintaining morale and discipline. Germany surrenders May 8, 1945. Galland survives to reflect on the bravery and futility of Luftwaffe's final months.